reading this morning is Proverbs 24, verses 30 to 34. I went past the field of a sluggard, past the vineyard of someone who has no sense. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds, and the stone wall was in ruins. I applied my heart to what I observed and learnt a lesson from what I saw. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. Glad you all got out of bed this morning. Otherwise, well, this sermon would be even more applicable to you. We're looking, as has been mentioned, continuing in the 7 deadly sins. And this morning is sloth, which is probably not a word you use very often or hear around very often. But in some ways, it is a sin that our society recognises. Our society has a bit of an interesting relationship with sloth. Sometimes it's almost celebrated. As someone in the 7:30 service reminded me, P's equal degrees. At uni, there's that thing, if you get anything more than 50% in the exam, you've put too much effort in. You could have just gotten past 51%. That's the way you get your degree. On the other hand, our society does have quite a moral judgment based on hard work or sloth. And often the way that it's expresses other sins. So for instance, there's a real lack of compassion when people talk about dole bludgers or routers, and there's often that judgment side of things coming through. And on the flip side, often when people talk about the virtues of hard work, they're using it in a prideful manner. I worked hard all my life. I deserve all sorts of things, whatever it is that they are wanting at the time. And it's seen as worthy as reward. But there is something valid about this idea that hard work is a good thing, and laziness and slothfulness is something that we need to be aware of. It's a deadly sin, and we're going to see a little bit why this morning. What does the Bible have to say all about this? Interestingly, not a lot, in some ways, not directly at least. The one exception is Proverbs, where it is actually talked about a bit more. The sluggard is kind of this character who comes up in many different Proverbs, and he's kind of this tragicomic figure. In some ways, it makes sense that it would come up in Proverbs, because Proverbs is a book that's focused on wisdom. And although it puts the fear of the Lord at the heart of wisdom, much of the wisdom it teaches is based on what is called general revelation, which simply means it's wisdom that is available to all people based on just observing the world and seeing what God has made clear to all people, not just people who know the scriptures. And the Proverbs' wisdom about sloth is in this category. It uses illustrations from the natural order to teach lessons about the importance of work. So for instance, famously in chapter 6, it says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest." All of us can see the way that ants work and take a lesson from it. Now, the passage that we read from Proverbs is likewise one that's based on observation. The speaker goes past the field of a sluggard, and he sees thorns everywhere, the ground covered with weeds, the stone wall in ruins. And he says in verse 24:32, "I applied my heart to what I observed and learned a lesson from what I saw." Just by seeing, he learned something. And this is, as we know as well as the proverb writer, it's just the way the world works, isn't it? Unless you put the effort in to maintain your farm or your lawn or your property, it will gradually degrade with time. A thriving vineyard can quickly become a run-down, unproductive property if it's neglected. And for those who rely on the land for their livelihood, as so many in the ancient world did, unproductive land means poverty. Now, the image might not be quite as clear for those who do other sorts of work, but I think we'd all agree that the principle is still the same, isn't it? If you're slack in the way that you run a business, you'll soon be out of business. If you are slack in the way that you do your job, you could very well end up out of a job. And perhaps more soberingly, on a personal note, if you don't put in effort into your marriage, you might lose your marriage. And in fact, if you don't put effort in any relationship, it's so easy to drift apart, isn't it? And the most frightening thing is about how gradually and gently it can happen. This is why I think sloth is a particularly deadly sin. Many of the other ones that we've looked at, the sin leads to consequences that can be swift and clear. If you succumb to greed and act corruptly in a business, chances are you will be dismissed on the spot, maybe imprisoned. If you succumb to lust, which James talked about last week, and commit adultery, your marriage could end pretty swiftly. But sloth is unspectacular and gradual, and yet equally destructive in the end. Proverbs 18:9 tells us that one who is slack in his work is a brother to one who destroys. Even though it doesn't seem like you're actively doing any harm, neglect and laziness can actually bring consequences of destruction. In fact, we know that in abuse, you don't have to hit someone to be abusive. Neglect is also a form of abuse. And as we see in so many of these examples, things get destroyed eventually by leaving them to run down. As our passage finishes, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief and scarcity like an armed man. It seems so innocent along the way, and yet it's deadly in the end, isn't it? There's also an incredible irony with sloth, because the whole point of being slothful is that you want the easy road, don't you? You want the easy way out of life, so you make as little effort as possible. And yet, the life lived in this way ends up being much harder. Proverbs 15:19 says, "The way of the sluggard is blocked with thorns, but the path of the upright is a highway." And even in what we've seen, we get a hint of why that's the case. Sloth can lead to lack and to poverty. That's going to make your life hard. And in so many ways, neglect in small things will lead to much bigger problems down the track that will take a lot more effort to fix. Proverbs 24 says, "Sluggards do not plough in season, so at harvest time they look, but find nothing." Or Ecclesiastes 10:18 says, "Through laziness the rafters sag, because of idle hands the house leaks." If you leave a problem, a maintenance issue, it's going to get much worse and be a much harder problem to fix down the track. And we know this from our own experience as well, don't we? In so many ways. If you don't brush your teeth, they're going to take a lot more effort to fix down the track. If you don't make the effort to ensure your spending is within your means, to do enough budgeting to make sure of that, you're going to be suffering later under crushing debt, and your budgeting will be a lot harder. I'm sure you could supply so many examples of your own. Like as the saying goes, a stitch in time saves 9. Laziness actually makes your life harder, not easier. My wife found recently a meme on Facebook that expresses this truth rather well, I think. It says, "Marriage is hard, divorce is hard, choose your hard. Obesity is hard, being fit is hard, choose your hard. Being in debt is hard, being financially disciplined is hard, choose your hard. Communication is hard, but not communicating is hard, choose your hard." Life will never be easy. It will always be hard, but we can choose our hard. Trying to take the shortcuts doesn't make life easier, does it? It just postpones the challenge, and it's going to be even harder in the end. So how do we avoid slothfulness? I think this one's quite a challenging one, because I think all of us have known times where we've tried to take the easy option We're all guilty to some extent, and I find this particularly challenging at times. One of the ways that Proverbs does it is almost a little bit unkind. It mocks the person of the sluggard. And I think one of the helpful things when we read this is that it's confronting. Let me read you the description in Proverbs 12 to 16. Do you see a person wise in their own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for them. A sluggard says, there's a lion in the road, a fierce lion roaming the streets. As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. A sluggard buries his hand in the dish, and he's too lazy to bring it back to his mouth. A sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 people who answer discreetly. Now, obviously, this picture's a bit over the top. I'm hoping that none of you are too lazy to eat your breakfast or to bring your spoon to your mouth. But it drives home the point rather painfully, doesn't it? Who wants to be this guy? Not me. Let's have a look a little bit closer. Firstly, this thing about the lion in the road in verse 13. It's an excuse, isn't it? This guy, remember, most people in those days were working outside on the farm. He's decided, oh no, I can't do that, it's dangerous. There could be lions about, ravenous lions. I'm actually being smart, staying inside where it's safe. But he's a fool, and it's an excuse for laziness. And verses 14 to 15 are such a powerful image of ineffectiveness and impotence, aren't they? As a door turns on its hinges, you can just imagine someone rolling over in bed and kind of tied to the bed. They can't go and do anything. Just like a door can never leave from that simple motion of swinging back and forth, back and forth. And the hand in the dish, isn't that a confronting image of not even looking after our own needs? And we see how that would obviously cost us in the end. And perhaps what is most confronting here is the sluggard's lack of awareness at their own pathetic state. And I think this is true for all of us. It's one of the sins that is very hard to see. All sin is hard to see because we are self-deceived. But facing up to your faults requires effort. It's a hard choice. It's a lot easier to pretend that you're all okay. And that sort of effort is the very thing that the sluggard lacks. Instead, as it says, the sluggard is wiser in their own eyes than 7 people who answer discreetly. Just like the excuse with the lion, he thinks he's being smart. Only suckers work hard. I've got a get-rich-quick scheme. I've got a way to get a degree that's easy. All these shortcuts in life seem very clever, don't they? The way that you get away with less effort. But ultimately, these things can bring ruin. The sobering warning that the beginning of the passage gives us is that a person wise in their own eyes, there's more hope for a fool than for them. And again, we can see why, right? If you're aware that your actions are foolish, there's hope that you might one day change. But if you think you're being terribly clever, you're blind to the fault. And there's no hope for you. So I think part of what Proverbs is doing is putting it to us in a very confronting way so that we're forced to challenge it and forced to face it. We need to ask ourselves the hard questions. Where are the ways that I am shirking my responsibilities? Maybe in the workplace, maybe at home, doing household chores. Without thinking to condemn, I think we've all had times where we just couldn't be bothered and we let someone else take up the slack. I know I'm guilty of that. The other thing about change, though, is we can't just look at the negative portrait. We actually need a positive portrait and a reason to do these things. Tim Keller very insightfully says, ironically, lazy people live dissatisfied lives because they are not dissatisfied with their lives enough. He reflects on another proverb in Proverbs 21, 25 to 26, which says, "The craving of a sluggard will be the death of him, because his hands refuse to work. All day long he craves for more, but the righteous give without sparing." See, the sluggard does want things, but they're selfish things. And also, even the selfish things that he wants, he doesn't love them enough to actually work for them. That's what verse 25 says. And it's exactly what we saw with that image of the spoon, right? Even for his own needs, he's not willing to put the effort in for what would give him satisfaction. The sluggard's desires are unfulfilled because he doesn't love deeply enough. There's nothing that he cares for enough to give it all he's got. In contrast, the righteous give without sparing. They care enough about other people that they can be generous. They're willing to work for that. There's a higher cause. And if we want an example of what this looks like, of course, we need to see the person of Jesus. Hebrews tells us to do this in Hebrews chapter 12. "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." See, Christ loved this world. His desires were deep. So much so that he took the hard road, not the easy one. He lived a difficult life. He was constantly working. Even when he went away to rest, the crowds followed him, and yet he had compassion on them and continued to work. And ultimately, he took the hard road all the way to the cross. Consider his example so that we will not grow weary and lose heart. If the sluggard is the negative picture, Jesus is what we aspire to. And of course, Jesus has actually taken away the thorns and the things that make our life hard. He's walked that hardest road so that we don't have to face the consequences of our laziness to their full extent. And because of that, we are freed to live a life of service rather than of sloth. And it's important that we do so. We've talked a lot about the worldly wisdom of Proverbs. The principle of things is that we need to work hard for success. But this is true even more in the spiritual realm. And I think this is where none of us can stand proudly. Even if you're a hard worker, work 9 till 5 or 6 till 8, whatever it is, I think all of us have at times failed, as the passage before the confession, to love God with all of our hearts, all of our minds, all of our soul, and all of our strength. We've neglected to love our neighbours as ourselves. Peter Jensen helpfully tells us that one of the things that sloth helps us with is understanding a different side of sin. Because we often think of it in terms of active rebellion against God. But neglect of him is also sinful. And sloth, I think, really captures that well. We don't seek him. We don't love him. We don't read our Bibles. We don't pray. We don't love our neighbours. We don't go out of our way to help people. And in their own way, these are just as active rebellion, even if they spring from, not from pride, but from slothfulness. And so as Christians, we are called to serve and called to be ready in service. That's what the passage in Luke and also in Thessalonians is about. Because we've been called to a new life, we have to be ready and active in service. Although we don't have Jesus standing over our shoulders in a physical way, he is coming back at any moment. And that's one of the great motivations. Just like the parable in the kids' talk of the master going away, so for us as Christians, the Lord will return. And that's our great hope, but also our great motivation. Because it'll be good if he finds us doing his work, and he will serve us. What an incredible turnaround on the image of a servant being served by the master. And yet, the flip side is also true. God's wrath will come on those who ignore him. And we see again in the picture of the poor manager that neglect, that slothfulness actually spills over into other sins, doesn't it? Because he neglects his duties, he starts to beat the other servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk. Laziness leads to falling into other sins. And those sins and his lack of diligence will lead to judgment. But in 1 Thessalonians, we have a much more hopeful picture. We are children of the day. We don't belong to the night. So this is where the New Testament, it's not a direct reference to slothfulness, but this idea of being people of the night who are sleeping and unawares and unprepared and complacent, versus people of the day who are alert and watching for the return of the Lord. There's this active service and this active living. And since we are people of the day, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as a breastplate. And notice as well in 1 Thessalonians that this is something that we are to do together. Verse 11, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. Part of that is acknowledging those who work hard amongst you. As Christians, we ought to honour people who work, and particularly those doing the spiritual work of leading us in church, people like Dave or our bishop. Their labours for us, we should be holding them in high regard and love because of their work. And on the flip side, if there are people who we see who are struggling in this area, we also have a role. Verse 14, warn those who are idle and disruptive, encourage the disheartened, help the weak, be patient with everyone. I think this is helpful too to correct some of the unhelpful ways our society treats people who don't work. You see, there's different categories of people. Some are indeed idle and disruptive. They're being rebellious. But there's also those who are disheartened. There is also those who are weak. And we need discernment, because sometimes people don't need you to come down like a ton of bricks, but need you to get alongside and encourage. And sometimes people need help and assistance. And even those who do need rebuke, we need to be patient. Be patient with everyone. And don't pay back wrong for wrong, but strive to do what is good. The last section gives us those sorts of works that we should be pursuing. Rejoicing always. That's God's work. Praying continually. Giving thanks in all circumstances. There's many other passages that have a similar idea of making this effort. In 2 Peter, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, goodness knowledge, knowledge self-control, self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. And in Hebrews 6:10-12, it says, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him, as you have helped his people and continue to help them. We want each of you to show this same diligence to the very end, so that what you hope for may be fully realized. We do not want you to become lazy, but to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. You see, just as in the physical, the real spiritual danger of slothfulness is that complacency. It creeps up on us. The world has carried on for 2,000 years since Jesus was here. It would be very easy to just pretend that he's not returning. But just as the gradual decay of property or the small problems becoming bigger problems in the physical world, so it is with the spiritual life. If we don't show the diligence to seek the Lord, then gradually our relationship with him will decay. And he's going to come suddenly when we don't expect it. But at the same time, although we are to work hard, we always need to remember the grace of the Lord Jesus. He doesn't just tell us to work hard at these things. He's given us the power by his Spirit. His death and resurrection have conquered death and sin. And as we trust him, he will do that work in us. The thing we need to do is not be neglectful, not be complacent, not be lazy, not be slothful, but instead turn to Jesus in faith and love. And the power of Christ will give you this perseverance that will carry you all the way to the end. Let me give thanks and pray. Father, we thank you so much for all that Christ has done and the ways that he diligently served us in so many ways. Father, help us not to be lazy. Help us to fulfill the responsibilities that you've given us, both in the mundane and the earthly things, so our spiritual duties. Help us to seek you with all our heart, to love you and to love our neighbours as ourselves. And Lord, thank you so much that it is the power of Christ that enables us to do these things. And we pray in his name. Amen.